and I'm happy you are you, my friend, and I'm awfully glad that I'm me. I love you for who you are, and friends will always be. We've traveled different paths, my friend, along life's winding journey, yet I have always been.
We're talking with David Meyer, who is the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, who says that his most recent trip to Israel has been one of the most important events that has affected you, right?
Absolutely.
And he's been to Israel many, many times, in addition to having lived there for a year when he was training to be a rabbi. And the question is, what happened that was so earth-changing or life-changing to David when he was there? So
the trip was for 2 days. And you might say, how do you have such a major experience the last 2 days? But they were a very full 2 days, September 7th and 8th.
And you spent one day?
One day meeting in Jerusalem with Israeli political and business and military leadership. And the next day in the West Bank, primarily in Ramallah, meeting with Palestinian government officials and business leaders. We were a small group. There were 7 rabbis who were invited by an independent news organization called the Media Line. And we were assembled specifically as a diverse group, but coming...
Men and women, conservative and reform.
Yes.
Yeah, and of varying political positions.
That's right. They really wanted a diverse group to come together with open minds, almost like a juror would ask to have an open mind, and carrying with us no agenda, no position that we needed to uphold, no responsibility to an organization, but being there on our own to hear.
To learn, right? So to open yourself up, and there's a story of in Zen of being an empty teacup, not letting your preconceptions glaze over what's actually happening.
That's right. And of course it's very difficult because anyone who pays a lot of attention to the news, who cares deeply about peace, about Israel, about the future well-being for the Palestinians as well as for the Israelis, it's difficult to empty oneself of those preconceived ideas. But going on both sides of the conflict, physically both sides of the separation seam between Israel and the West Bank, gave us the opportunity to do that.
The Media Line, how can there be a neutral or an independent news? Tell me a little bit about them.
They are really dedicated to creating greater transparency and opportunity for hearing the full 360-degree story of life in the Middle East, the peace process, the concerns of individual people. And it's not unusual at all for a story written by one of the Media Line journalists to appear simultaneously in English in the Jerusalem Post, in Hebrew in one of the Israeli dailies, and in Arabic in places such as Al Jazeera or even the Yemen Times. They have established a reputation for a truly balanced and open approach to bringing journalists and business people and politicians into both sides of the conflict.
So yours isn't the only trip like this.
No.
They're trying to educate,
That's
correct,
right.
a whole group of movers and shakers who
That's
can
right.
make a difference.
That's right, and to give people the opportunity to see with their own eyes the facts on the ground, rather than having to rely on whatever is filtered through other media.
Okay, so you went to Jerusalem, and who did you meet with from the government?
We met with the Arab Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister, who is the one who is the face of the Israeli government in the Arab world, but also pays very careful attention to the goings-on in the social media in the Arab world and the mainstream media as well. We met with the chief spokesperson for the Israel Defense Force and learned...
Who was a woman.
A woman,
Yeah.
Avital Leibowitz. We met with business leaders including the CEO of the Israel Palestinian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and his partner, a Palestinian, who is the head of the Import-Export Union among the Palestinians.
And what you were telling me is that both the West Bank and Israel have agreed to unite that function of Chamber of Commerce, correct?
Well, this organization, the Israel Palestinian Chamber of Commerce, does include businesses that are partnerships between Israelis and Palestinians that are both, some of them are in the West Bank, some of them are in Israel, and there's even trade in Gaza going on.
And the ones in the West Bank are run by Arabs, right?
By Palestinians,
yes,
that's
so
right.
by Palestinians, correct.
That's right.
Are those two terms interchangeable or not?
No, because Arabs can exist
So
anywhere,
I should
right.
use Palestinians
I think
to
it's
refer.
more,
Yeah, okay.
particularly in the West Bank. But there is a great amount of trade, and this is one of those examples that you never hear about. There, according to the CEO of the chamber, there's some $4 billion in trade between Israel and Palestinians every year. So they're
Going both ways.
Going both ways. Most of it is from Israel into Palestinian lands, but it does go both ways. And there are joint partnerships, joint ownerships of businesses between Israel and Palestinians. So there's a lot going on, but it's still in its infancy in many ways. We also met with a couple of other government officials. Mark Regev is the chief spokesperson for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and you would recognize him from it being interviewed frequently on the international news, and also with a member of the Knesset, a parliament minister, who we shared dinner with. Now, we were 7 rabbis, which meant that both in Israel and with the Palestinians, our meetings were very intimate, a couple of them around meals. So that was, it's just a wonderful way to really get to know, really be able to look someone in the eye, really hear what people are saying coming from their hearts.
And this media spokesman, as well as the Arab Affairs advisors, are both close to Netanyahu.
That's correct.
So you were essentially, it was the same as speaking directly about what the Prime Minister thinks.
That's right. That's right. There was some talk that was carried on off the record, as it were. But for the most part, we were hearing from government authorities the position of the Israeli government.
Okay, so that was one day. And how did you leave that one day feeling?
I felt that one day was worth the whole trip, even though had I been offered one day of meeting in a small group with high-level Israeli officials, I might not have agreed to the rigor of such a short turnaround. But having the chance to have a very honest, a very deep and probing conversation with these representatives, with these men and women.
And you felt they
wonderful.
weren't just spouting the party line?
Sometimes. But spouting it would indicate that they were not deeply engaged and believers in what they stand for.
But there was lots of, they didn't just talk and talk. You got a chance to
ask questions,
yeah.
ask difficult questions, and ask personal questions as well.
Like?
I asked one of the members of the Knesset, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Oh, all right.
And he said,
what?
In the long term, I'm an optimist about the possibilities for establishing an end to the conflict.
But he didn't tell you how long term, right? He could have been talking about 3,000.
Well, I think that that's a very common response. Short term, it's going to be hard, but someday it's going to happen.
Okay, so then the next day.
The next day was the day that separated this trip from any experience I had had before, going into the West Bank.
Yeah.
A place where Israelis are not allowed, unless they have very, very specific kinds of papers, such as journalists.
Did you bring Israeli journalists with you?
We had 2 journalists made the trip with us.
And
yes.
did you have any Palestinian journalists when you were there?
No.
No, okay.
No.
All right.
We crossed the checkpoint into the West Bank, into the Palestinian-controlled areas, where we were met with security forces that had been arranged, Palestinian security, of course, by the Palestinian Prime Minister's office. Right. There were approximately 5 policemen, a police van, a police car, a plainclothes Palestinian. They escorted us wherever we went. And
did you feel any hostility from the people in the street? We
didn't have a lot of connection with the people in the street. They didn't want us to have a lot of connection, although the people in Ramallah are very used to people coming back and forth to do business in Ramallah. Just what they're not used to is having rabbis coming into Ramallah. And so they were very careful. The only place where we really interacted with non-official meetings was in a coffee shop where I sat with the owner of a coffee shop, a woman entrepreneur who's creating a chain of coffee shops in Ramallah, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem.
And she's getting the money to start that from?
Investments. She's some venture capital coming in, and there are a lot of investments coming in to promote Palestinian businesses, both from Palestinians and from other Arabs, from Israelis as well. That has to kind of come under the table, and even Americans. Yes, Europeans as well.
Whom did you meet with?
So again, in Ramallah, we met with government officials and we met with business leaders. We met with...
And not military, as I just learned, because it's a non-militarized zone.
That's right.
All right.
So we met with the media spokesperson for the Prime Minister. We were supposed to meet with the Prime Minister of the Palestinians, Salam Fayyad, under whose bureaucratic leadership the infrastructure for the future Palestinian state is being created. It's an economic infrastructure, it's the infrastructure of security. Unfortunately, because of the Palestinian plan to take their claim to the United Nations, a lot was going on. The Prime Minister was called to Dubai, so we met with his chief spokesperson instead.
But he has a very good record on corruption, isn't that correct?
Yes, the Prime Minister Fayyad has cleaned up so much of the corruption.
Because you can't do business in a thoroughly corrupt, that just destroys.
And under Chairman Arafat, the international aid was being siphoned off. It wasn't getting to where it was supposed to get. There was rampant corruption that needed to be cleaned up in order to allow the banking industry and the business community to grow.
And ordinary citizens, to function.
And he also, the Palestinian Authority under Fayyad have done what they said they would do, which was the dismantling of the organizations of terror. And over the last couple of years, aside from the isolated incidents of individuals, which you can do very little about, we can't stop that in this country, there has been a ceasing of terror to the extent that even the Israeli security forces recognize that you have to give credit where credit is due. So the underpinnings of the state are very much in place. Of course, how do you get there is a matter of ongoing controversy. There have been no formal negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians now for a couple of years.
Now, explain to me, here we've got a kind of a reasonable leader, right? Is he elected, or was it an election? Do you know how he...
Yes, so
it's a semi-democracy, right?
There's the beginnings of democracy going on.
Okay, so it's probably as responsible as many of the governments that we consider democracies.
That are beginning to establish
yes,
democracies.
now why can't there be negotiations between them and the people in Jerusalem?
And it depends on who you ask. If you ask the Palestinians, they will tell you that the primary obstacle to peace and to negotiations, and I'll use their wording, is the continuing construction of illegal Jewish settlement activity on future Palestinian lands.
Right.
I asked the media spokesman for the Palestinian Authority a very direct question. I was nervous, I have to say. I had only been in Ramallah for a half hour, and I was certainly like a fish out of water, and I'm no diplomat. But I felt I needed to ask a question. Here's what I said to him. And I looked him right in the eye, and I said to Ghassan Khatib, you, as a Palestinians, are speaking of one voice, that it's the settlement issue that is the primary obstacle to peace. I said, if I were to ask the people in my community and the Israeli government, they will say that the primary obstacle to peace is the refusal of the Palestinians to recognize the right of the Jewish people to live in a state in their historic homeland. And I said to him, what shall I tell my people? What shall I bring back to my community?
And what did he say?
He didn't give me a very satisfactory answer, I have to admit. What he said was that when the Oslo Accords were agreed upon, that language was created of mutual recognition, that this specific terminology of a Jewish homeland was not part of that agreement, and that once we agree to borders, that will be an implicit recognition of Israel's right to exist, but not as a Jewish state. And that is an issue when we talk about the future claims of the descendants of the refugees.
All right, but you know what makes a difference there, which is if the Arabs accept the right of Israel to exist as a political entity, that means that it's not a matter of life and death, which is what many pro-Israeli, the Israeli position is. They want to obliterate us. So would you say that at least in the West Bank, it's not obliteration? They may not accept it as a Jewish homeland, but they do, the government at least, accept it as a political recognized entity.
And I think that's correct. I think that's correct. Whether or not that is, as of yet, the opinion of the majority on the streets who have been raised with the idea of obliteration of the Jews and Israel, I don't know. But certainly for the business leaders who want to engage and be part of the innovation of Israel, they are natural business partners. I know we'll talk more about that.
Well, tell me now about what you saw, what the Palestinians said about economic hope of cooperation between the two areas.
And I met with the CEO, he was actually called the Director General of Quds Bank in Ramallah. Quds Bank, I believe, is the second largest bank in the Palestinian lands. And I asked him very directly, have you been able to see over these last couple of years a correlation between economic development and a cessation of violence and terror? And he said, absolutely. When people have hope for the future, that they can build a better life for themselves and their family, they are much less likely to blow themselves up.
Right.
And I heard that theme both on the Israeli side of the separation seam and the Palestinian side. That
you mean the Israelis recognize that if they have economic hopes, they will be more peaceful?
That's right. And the Israelis want that too. There were massive demonstrations throughout Israel all summer of Israelis standing up and saying, we want social justice. We want the opportunity to have a better life. It's what both sides really want. Once you get past the extreme element of those who say what we want is the destruction of the Jewish people and state, that aside, and in the West Bank, as businesses begin to develop and people begin to have an hope for an economic future, I think that's where the ultimate hope lies for the peace process.
Well, think of it this way. If you ask an ordinary citizen, what would you rather have? The completion of some political goal out there or a good life for yourself? I don't think there's too much to debate there.
That's right.
So that if they're offered a chance to raise their children in peace and have a roof over their house and security.
And a nice car, and a computer, and medicine, and higher education. Israelis and Palestinians are natural partners in business. They are because they live in proximity to each other, and the peoples are very similar.
I know.
They are Western. Remember, I mentioned a woman entrepreneur in the West Bank. You would not have that in most Arab countries where, frankly, women aren't allowed to drive or vote. They value higher education. They are innovators. They're natural partners. And frankly, most Arab nations will not do business with Israelis. The Palestinians will. And so they're very natural partners. And there is developing business partnerships, and I think it's through those partnerships that trust can be reestablished between the two sides, and that hopefulness for the future can begin to emerge.
So when you met these people in Ramallah, you felt they were reasonable, right?
Absolutely.
And so did that leave you optimistic? Were you surprised?
No, I wasn't surprised. I've had many opportunities to interact with Palestinians, and they've been positive interactions for the most part. Not entirely, but for the most part. And had I only been meeting with politicians, I probably would have come away disheartened, because both sides have their narrative. Both sides have, and their narratives are different.
Right.
And it's very difficult to get past their narratives, whether it's on the Palestinian side, the narrative of victimization, or on the Israeli side, the constant wars against terror and violence that they've had to secure themselves against. But the business community seems to have a way of looking not at the past but at the future. What do we need to do to get this done? And there's a can-do attitude. There's an energized feeling. And again, I think that that's where my hope and my seed of hope came from. It was a very unique experience. I want to share with you something we didn't talk about before, just a moment that for me was very powerful. Over the last several years, as that separation seam between Israel and the West Bank was being built, and it was built to prevent incursions of terror, snipers, and other activities.
The wall.
Part of it's a wall, most of it's a fence. But I refer to it as a seam because it is a dividing point.
All right.
And it's a secure dividing point. And it's worked because as that wall or fence has been created, terror has diminished. And it's been successful in that regard, although nobody likes the seam. The Israelis who have to maintain it, the Palestinians who have to negotiate it, and the businesses that have to cross it in order to get work done. No one likes it, but it's worked.
And you said that the whole thing of crossing that barrier is full of red tape.
Absolutely.
And depends on what officer is sitting there, so it doesn't run smoothly either.
It's very easy to get delayed,
Yeah.
and bureaucracy is part of the reality of the Middle East on whatever side. But I realized that in all the years, and I've seen pretty much the length and width of that seam, I've even hiked parts of it, but I'd always seen it from one side. That is from the side of Israel, which is, that is built to keep them out. When I crossed through and I looked back at the same barrier, I was seeing it from the perspective of that's there to keep us in. And I tried to hold that very honest feeling of there's two sides to that seam. There are more than one barrier to peace. And from that, to engage in conversation.
Do you think if the Palestinians had built the wall, you would have felt, that was built to keep them out?
It's an interesting question.
But it is interesting. It makes a difference which side of the wall you're on, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
And of course, the Israelis have much more freedom of movement into an outer world.
Yes, yeah, I think that's true. Although Palestinians can travel among the Arab lands, Israelis are not allowed to travel into the Palestinian lands and most Arab countries. So Israelis are also limited in the way they can move.
Travel, right.
And hopefully that will be, once there is a settlement, once the conflict comes to an end, that mobility will also be part of a better future.
You said that on both sides there was an acknowledgement of mistakes. Tell me what the Israelis thought they might have done wrong.
I think that, and it depends on who you're talking to.
Oh, yeah.
Again, Israelis, the political spectrum in Israel is extremely wide.
Yes, just from your experience.
And from my experience, I do think that there's a sense that the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, as it was done, that was partially responsible for allowing Hamas, a terrorist organization, to come into power, may have been a mistake. And had they included the Palestinian Authority in the process of evacuating all of the settlements, which they did, there are no settlements in Gaza, perhaps they would have allowed the strengthening of the Palestinian Authority and not permitted Hamas to come into power. There's some political opinions who agree with that. So what you're saying is
the terrorists took credit, said, look, we drove them out, they just walked away.
That's right.
Whereas if they had said, we're putting our trust in you, et cetera, but who was the head of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza at the time, do you know?
It was Mahmoud Abbas still at the time.
Yeah. Was that part of what made it impossible?
Perhaps.
But
on the Palestinian side, even a very, very stringent and strident Palestinian spokesperson said that responding to the Oslo Accords with more violence in the hope to achieve something more, engaging the Israeli military caused the Israeli populace to move to the right. And we are responsible for that, and that was a mistake. I was shocked to hear this representative admit to that. So that's as far as I can really
So you know
get.
something? I want to say that probably the only reason these people on both sides are able to admit to perhaps errors of judgment is because you were listening. If you had been saying, oh, you people did such and such wrong, they would have been defending themselves. So then in a way, listening to get both sides of the story and to, since both people have some right on their position, to give them that sense of, I understand what you've been through, then they can say, they can admit.
If they know you're listening with an open heart, absolutely.
Right.
Now, there are different narratives, and I have to say that I believe that the Palestinians really play a little bit loose with history and don't acknowledge, for example, the historic place of Israel in Jewish history and the role that Judaism played in the development of Israel. And I think that's a problem.
Well, let me just say, my husband is a psychiatrist, also feels that people play fast and loose with their history. We only have a minute or two left.
Please.
What major thoughts did you come away with?
One thought is very personal, and that is that some people would accuse one of going to listen to somebody who has a very different opinion, a very different narrative, and hearing openly and honestly that that's a kind of weakness or gullibility. I think it's a kind of strength and takes a degree of bravery.
Absolutely. I wish the U.S. did more of it.
And I think that coming away and seeing both sides of that seam, good people on both sides want to see the best for their families, for the future, for their children. And at some point, the conflict will come to an end. And hopefully it can come to an end sooner rather than later, so that that hopeful future is closer. That optimism that so many hold on to is not something we're going to have to wait another generation or two to achieve.
And you would say then that an economic progress is a key to reducing the tensions, right?
Absolutely.
In the Palestinian
Absolutely.
state.
And there's problems with capitalism, don't get me wrong,
Right.
but I do believe that economic development and partnerships will go a long way to establishing trust, to building that better future,
Right.
and it's something that they can share and need to share together.
Thank you very much, and I want to congratulate you,
Thank you.
because I really think that for Jewish leaders to go over and try to get a more balanced picture is key to unraveling, this knot that is so tightly tied there that we can barely find the ends of it.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for coming.